Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast. And today, we're excited to be talking with some of our friends from across the pond. We're headed back to Kiplin Hall in North Yorkshire, in the beautiful British Isles. And we're going to be talking with them about a big project that they have coming up called Interpreting Kiplin for 400. Many of you remember our other conversations that we've had with various folks at Kiplin. And because of the relationship, the dynamic relationship between us and Kiplin is founded around or based around the fact that it is the ancestral home of the Calvert family, which was the European family that landed on the shores of Maryland back in the 1630s. And this is sort of the other part of that story that goes back all the way into the Jacobean era in the United Kingdom. But today we're going to be talking with Naomi Peach, who is the project officer for this ambitious Interpreting Kiplin for 400. And we're going to be talking all about what that means and its 400th birthday at a time when here in the United States, we're thinking all about our 250th birthday. But before we get there, we like to get to know people. So Naomi, where did you grow up and how did you get into this line of work?
Hi, yeah. So I grew up in East Yorkshire, about 2 hours away from Kiplin Hall, and I've always visited historic houses and museums with my family. We're all big history lovers, and so I've known I wanted to be involved in heritage in some way since I was a small child. I did my first work experience in a historic house when I was 15. So I knew fairly early on that's what I wanted to do. And so I did a history degree after I finished school. And then graduated in the pandemic, which was a great time to graduate. So I went and did a distance learning master's online during the pandemic. And then after that, I managed to get a job in the field, which was fantastic. I worked for the National Trust up at Cragside House in Northumberland for a couple of years, which was fantastic. And then after that, I ended up at Kiplin.
Well, all these places just sound sort of magical, but
they definitely are.
Yeah, and they have stories unto themselves. So you mentioned the one that you worked at with the National Trust. What was the one that you volunteered at when you were young?
I volunteered at one called Baron Agnes Hall in East Yorkshire, which is just a little privately owned hall, again, sort of Elizabethan Jacobean. Quite similar to Kiplin in many ways, actually, but still, the family still live there. It's very homely, and I like a historic house that you feel like you could live in. That's my favorite kind, I think. Well, you think I could move in tomorrow.
Yeah, and did you? Well, two questions there. First I'll just ask, did you grow up in a historic home?
No, I didn't. I think I'd be very good at living in a historic home, I have to say. But no, my family, just a very normal, semi-detached and a nice neighborhood.
Yeah. And then the other question is, what aspect of sort of this work draws you most? I know we've talked to your colleague Alice, and she's obviously very interested in sort of the domestic life in these homes. Is there a certain aspect that draws you? Some people come to it from the architecture side or the social side, but what is your sort of passion?
It's definitely, I'd say, the social side of it. I love the stories of the people who lived in the houses, both the families, but also then the staff as well, and all the relationships that these people had to each other, and yeah, just I just love being in those places where you know that people have lived for hundreds of years, and there's so many, they lived each day in and out there, and there's so many stories to unpick from that. Just normal people living normal lives, but for a long time.
Yeah, and I think that for the American audience, which is probably, I would imagine, the majority of our audience, although I think we do have a few listeners overseas now. But for people who are, passionate about history here, I mean, at least for me and for many that I talk to, what draws us to these English and these European stories is that they're just so much older, right? Like
Yeah.
we think a property that is, if we there's just a handful, maybe even a handful of structures here in Maryland that actually date to the 1600s. And something really old is like the early 1700s or mid 1700s. But the idea of these chapels and places that go back 1,000 years is just wild. And so I think that that's sort of the excitement. And it's funny because even as you move across the United States, something in California that dates from the 1890s is like really, really old. And they perceive what's happening in Maryland as just ancient, and then you go to the UK and it's even greater. So that those layers of history are really exciting. And I know we've talked to Alice a little bit about that. And I have to imagine that that's going to be part of the conversation around Kiplin's 400. But for somebody who hasn't listened already to one of our other episodes about Kiplin Hall, and they're just picking up the story here, how would you describe Kiplin? Like what's the way, the short version of kind of putting Kiplin in context and why it's a place that matters?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Kiplin Hall was built about 400 years ago by George Calvert, the first Baron Baltimore, whose family went on to sail across to Maryland, as we call it in the UK, Maryland.
Which I have to just stop. We all love the way you pronounce it. We all want to say it like that, but we don't want to like just put that affectation on. But we all love the way you say it. We're going to have to record that for the podcast or something.
I'm glad. Sometimes we're in the office at Kiplin, whenever anybody says Maryland, I go Maryland.
Maryland.
But yes, so that's the sort of the initial story of the hall, is that he had it built. We don't really know why. He grew up. He was born in the area, but probably never came and lived at Kiplin. But his family then owned it for a couple of generations, and then it passed down through 4 families. So the Calverts, who built it, then went to the Crows, and then to the Carpenter family, and then to the Talbot family. And then in 1971, Bridget Talbot, who was the last owner of Kiplin Hall, died, but she'd set up a charitable trust to take care of the hall. And so the trust has been caring for the hall the last 50 years now. And so now it's a historic house, gardens and cafe that the public can visit.
And I've heard that perhaps it was Calvert's like hunting lodge, or it was, and then I've also heard that this was sort of like, he was not tremendously wealthy before he left, but when he came back, built this thing to sort of be like, look what I did, sort of. Is there a sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing some research into it for our 400th anniversary. We're trying to sort of get to the bottom of it. And to be honest, I don't think we ever will get to the complete bottom of it, because 400 years ago, there's not an awful lot of records that survive. But we expect that it may have been that his father lived here. It may have been a house that he built for his father. But the sense that he went back to the area he was born in once he'd sort of done good and made a bit of money and gone back and built something spectacular, that feels like the kind of thing that might have happened.
It's just fascinating, and that's obviously like all tied up in the Maryland story. Like this is, I think, if you interpreted it just as a British story or even just as a Maryland, it loses some of its value. But it's sort of this cross-Atlantic conversation about making wealth in the colonies and bringing that back, and how you made that wealth in the colonies, and whose land you were on. Because we always say that the Calverts are the first European family, or the European family that kind of leads this expedition here, but there were many people living here in what today is the United States when they arrived, and they would have and we know this, would have met native peoples in Maryland. And then, of course, there's the introduction of slavery. So there's all these different threads and pieces that get wrapped up into this Kiplin story in those beautiful Jacobean walls. So that it gives you a lot to work with for the 400th anniversary. And so one thing that I think this audience will be interested in, because I'm always like super jealous of it, is the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So before we even get into the 400th, what is the National Heritage Lottery Fund?
So the National Lottery Heritage Fund is a national, in the name, funding body. And so the money all comes from national lottery players. So people who, put in with a lottery ticket, that money goes into a fund that's used for various things, including the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which is, I think, the largest funder in the UK for heritage. And so they give grants of millions of pounds every year to support and grow heritage. And their main thing is about increasing access to heritage and improving it for a wider audience.
Yeah, super jealous of it. We don't have a function like that here in the United States. Although some states have linked gaming and gambling in particular with heritage and historic preservation. I know in Colorado, the gaming tax from casinos supports historic preservation. And then our Historic Preservation Fund for the United States is funded off of the offshore oil leases of the country. So we all find unique ways of doing it, but I'm always impressed by this fund and just the breadth and diversity of things that it supports. So what is your role within the 400th? How does that tie back to this fund, and what are you guys working on?
So back in 2022, Kiplin Hall applied and was successful in getting funding for this project, the Interpreting Kiplin 400 project, which Alice and James, who you've had both of them on the podcast, I believe, applied for and was successful in getting. And that's where I came on board. I was hired specifically for this project to work on it, initially for 18 months, but it ended up being just over 2 years, actually, that I've been here. And so the project aims to create new interpretation for the 400th anniversary next year. And by interpretation, we mean any way that we're telling stories in the hall and the gardens. So there were specific areas that were identified that needed more and new interpretation. Partly based as well, we were building a new visitor centre. So that was freeing up some spaces inside the hall with some of the relocation of a cafe. And so it was identified that we could be telling some stories in there about Kiplin's 400 years of history. So that's what we've been working on for the last 2 years, and it's been being installed this week. So it's very very poignant that we're chatting about it today.
Yeah, it's like perfect timing, and hopefully you guys can share this conversation out. We'll have it up soon with your British audience. And I'm curious, like, when you go to tell a story, you have to decide what parts you're going to put in. Otherwise, you just overwhelm people. Like, because I'm sure 400 years of stories, there are, 1,000 stories for every year. So before you know it, you're in the millions of stories category, and that you can't do that way. So how did you sort of organize it? How did you decide to, use a storytelling method, or what way did you go to bring order to the madness of 400 years?
So one of the central things that we've done as part of this project is work with local community groups. So we established focus groups from a few sort of target audiences, those being people from local villages who had historic connections to Kiplin, mainly that people from those villages had worked at Kiplin in the past. Disabled adults was another key community, and also refugees who settled in North Yorkshire. So a really wide range of different kinds of people who we don't have from our audience data, we don't have a huge draw for at the moment. And so we worked with those groups to decide what stories they wanted to be told, which was really challenging at first, because as you say, like 400 years of stories and history is a lot. And even I've been working there for 2 years, and there's still so many that you come across that you just had no idea were there. So it was really challenging, sort of getting them to a point where they felt comfortable in sort of making some decisions about what stories they wanted to be told. But it's been really interesting to hear from different people and see what interests them and what stands out and what they feel is sort of the overarching story of Kiplin, and then what stories within that represent that well, which it's been a real journey over the last 2 years, but we're really happy with how it's all evolved and the stories that we have ended up telling.
So did you organize it into different sort of buckets of stories, or what would people see when they come to the house and to the visitor center, I should imagine too?
Yeah. So some of the spaces that we were interpreting were fairly simple in the sort of the stories that would make sense telling them. So one of the spaces was a garden called Lady Tyrconnell's garden, who Lady Tyrconnell lived at Kiplin Hall in the 1800s. So it made sense to tell a little bit of her story in that space. And then we have the Maryland garden, which makes sense to then tell the story of the Calvert family going over to Maryland and exploring a little bit about their lives there. We then had some inside spaces that were much more difficult because they didn't have as obvious a story to tell. And the project's called Interpreting Kiplin for 400. And so in the main gallery that's been produced as part of this project, we are doing a snapshot of 400 years of history. So we've picked top highlights for each of the four families, and including also our fifth family, as we call them, which is our volunteers, and the history of Kiplin in the more recent past as well. And so we have 5 new interpretation hubs that tell a little bit of those stories, just as an introduction, before people go around the rest of the house. And then we've also, it's no small project, we've also got a space that tells the story of some of the staff as well, because that was identified as being a really important story to tell people who lived and worked at Kiplin, because I think those are the people that often we relate the most to, as normal people. So that was a really important story to tell too.
Yeah, it's hard to relate to a baron sometimes.
Yeah,
at least personally speaking, I don't know if you're royalty. But I'm curious, when you said the Maryland garden, maybe for the listeners here, give us a sense for what would you find in the Maryland garden and what kind of interpretation are you using? Because we have a lot of museum professionals, preservationists that listen and are always curious about different styles and tools of interpretation. Are we looking at is there fixed interpretation? Are there waysides? Are there imagery? What would they find in the garden versus what might they find in one of those rooms?
So initially when we started, the Maryland garden had already been established. So there's a lovely sort of gazebo, pergola kind of thing that's in the space, and then some planting that is of species native to Maryland. So that's sort of the canvas that we're working from. And when we took all of the focus groups that we were working with up to that space and sort of we'd given them a bit of an introduction to the overall story of the Calverts going to Maryland. And as we were walking up to this little garden, which is, you can see it from the hall, it's just it's probably about half a mile up a little hill. And as we were walking up to the garden, someone in the group said, well, it kind of feels like we're walking to Maryland, this is quite a long way. And so actually what we've really done is used the experience of the journey and of actually getting to the garden. So the garden has actually ended up being sort of the final destination. And so we've used fixed panels up the path that leads to the garden. So the first one really leaned into that. We wanted it to be a sense of discovery, and that sense of journey was really important. So the first panel is in the shape of a ship's mast to give that sense that you're on a ship.
Oh, that's cool.
And then you follow the journey up the path. So you zigzag up, and your sort of sense of discovery is that it's not immediately obvious where the next panel is. You have to go and find it, and you follow the journey of the Ark and the Dove to Maryland. Arriving in Maryland, and there's a panel inside the pagoda that has a little bit of introduction, sort of suggesting what the first little bit of time they spent in Maryland might be. And it's also really important to us that we've really just been trying to get the visitors into the shoes of the people who were on the boat. So lots of questions and asking people to imagine what it would have been like. So yeah, just trying to create sort of an experience in that interpretation.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's also interesting too about kind of putting people in the shoes of the people that were in the boat, because, or the ships, because yes, there were, the Calverts and sort of this upper crust of British society, but there was also more middling and lower class people that came along that were going to be doing the working and the toiling, and we don't know as much about them, but they were there as well. So there was, there's layers to all of these stories, which I think is sort of cool. And so when does the exhibit open? What are you hoping, is the response? Is there a big rollout of it? And if somebody's planning, which a lot of people are, trips to the UK, well, we'll talk about that specifically, but what's the rollout, and then we'll talk about how people can get there and all that good stuff. But, what's the hope? What does success look like?
Yeah, so it's all installed right now, but we reopen for our 400th anniversary on the 7th of February 2025, and we'll be open all the way through to Thanksgiving in November next year. So yeah, we've got a big program planned around as well for next year, but the interpretation will all be there and ready and shiny and new for people to enjoy come February.
And I like that you say it runs until Thanksgiving, which is not normally a date on the British calendar. So you've kind of picked up a thread there, and we talked extensively. So Alice had a chance to come and visit us in the United States recently, and we had the opportunity to talk to her. She got to experience an American Thanksgiving. And we got to talk to her about what that might look like and things that could be interpreted around Thanksgiving, because I know that's a differentiator for you, which is sort of cool that you guys get to focus in on that, because I think it's sort of unique. I guess it would be like an American house museum doing a Boxing Day event, which we also don't have. So we'll have to come over and learn what that all means. So what does success look like, though? So you're going to open it. We know when it's happening. What are you really hoping for? Is it increase in visitation? Is it a financial success? Is it awareness? Is it all of the above? Like, how do you define success? I have to imagine that the lottery fund wants to know what they paid for, what they got. So what does that successful grant report look like?
Yeah, I mean, at its core, we're hoping that we'll have more visitors. That is, it's an important thing. We rely on the income from ticket sales. That is really important. But what we're really hoping for with this project is that it will widen our audience. So the reason that we've worked with the different community groups is to try and make the new interpretation appeal to a wider group of people, that they feel that there's something there for them. So what we're really hoping for is that we have a more diverse audience base come the new year. We'll be doing all sorts of formal evaluation for the National Lottery. As you say, they rightfully want to know that their money has been spent, and whether the money that the National Lottery players have put into it as well. This is members of the public who fund it, basically. We'll be. But I think also what's really exciting about this new interpretation is that these are spaces that have never had interpretation in them before. So what we're really hoping for, outside of an increase of numbers and increase in diversity, is just that people will learn something new when they come to Kiplin. That we're diversifying the stories that we're telling, where we're telling them. Some of this interpretation is outside in the grounds, which is we haven't had much of that before. So we're just really hoping that people, that a visit to Kiplin will be a fuller experience for everybody with this new interpretation.
And when you say rooms that weren't interpreted, do you mean that they just sort of had furnishings in them, but there was no text, there were no images? It was just you kind of walked around and saw books and chairs and tables and couches?
So the two rooms inside the hall that we've interpreted as part of this project were formerly our tea room and the kitchen to serve the tea room.
Oh, okay.
So previously you've been able to go into the tea room, but obviously it's been filled with chairs and tables and people having lovely homemade soups and cakes. We do very good cakes and soup if you come for a visit. But so yes, they've just been part of the visitor experience in a broader sense, but we've never told any history in those spaces.
That makes
And
sense.
so the kitchen, 3 weeks ago, it was still a working kitchen, but it's now like a proper gallery space with displays in. And so there's a little bit more for people to see and new stories being told.
That's fantastic. And I think that there's a lot of lessons there, too, for historic sites, because not all of them here in the United States, not many of them really at this point, probably have tea rooms. Although we were talking with Alice that was historically something that American house museums had. They've pretty much all been closed and those spaces reinterpreted. We don't really have many sites that have tea rooms anymore.
Well, that's really interesting because that's such a central part of the British experience of going to a historic house.
Yeah,
You couldn't imagine a historic house without a cafe or a tea room here. And a lot of people go just for the cafe.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, there might be some of the larger ones, thinking like a Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, have a full scale restaurant on site. But if you were just to go to a run of the mill historic house museum anywhere in the US, the odds that you'd be able to sit down and have tea and delicious little cakes like were described at Kiplin would be unlikely. Although 100 years or so ago, they were very common. In fact, our organization that powers PreserveCast, Preservation Maryland, once ran a historic house museum many, many years ago, 50 odd years ago. And it had a tea room in it. And then that was transitioned out because they were concerned about sort of the impact of that on the space. But I think it's fascinating that you're still not fascinating. It's great. It's cool that you're still maintaining that on site, just in a different way. And I think there's some lessons there, though, for other house museums here, because sometimes they will put in, offices or other things or storage on a second floor, and then that won't be open. And so thinking about how you reuse and maximize the use of space, I think, is really interesting. So I know you mentioned you were on sort of first an 18-month, then a 24-month. So where does Naomi Peach go after all of this?
Yeah, so unfortunately, my time at Kiplin comes to an end at the end of this year, which I'm really sad about. I have really loved Kiplin, so I'll be moving on to a new role elsewhere come January.
Do you know where that is?
I do, yeah. I don't know whether I'm allowed to say. So.
You don't have to say it. It's fine. But are you? How about this? Are you staying in the historic house museum world?
Yeah, I'm going to another council museum service that run a few different museums and a historic house. So yeah, definitely staying within the world.
Yeah, how about this in 2025? Let's have you back and you can talk about that, because the American audience is always interested in what's going on over in the UK, and picking up lessons that the way people do things elsewhere is always interesting. So before we go, we always ask people if they have a favorite historic place or site. We've gotten a little bit kinder in asking this question, because sometimes people won't pick one, and we say, well, what's the most interesting you've most recently been to? But yeah, within that vein, where would you go?
I mean, obviously I have to say Kiplin is of course my favorite historic place or site. But if we were talking about somewhere that wasn't Kiplin, it's really hard. I have been to many, many historic places. My family, every year we go on a holiday to somewhere in the UK and we try and visit as many historic places as possible in that week. I think our record is about 15 in 7 days.
Whoa.
So we're serious heritage and historic place visitors. But I think off the top of my head, I think my favourite one that sort of sticks out to me is a place called Warkworth Castle up in Northumberland. I used to live up there and work up there, and that was my local castle, which is a crazy thing to say.
It is. I don't have one.
No, well, where I grew up, there weren't very many castles, and so the novelty of a castle being just 10 minutes away never sort of got lost to me. So I'd go and have a picnic there on my days off, and just wander over if the I just felt like it. And it's a really gorgeous castle. So yeah, I think that one's my favorite.
Well, I think that might be our first castle answer, so we'll take it. And appreciate you telling us all about what's happening at Kiplin. If people want to visit, we'll have links in the show notes on how to get that information. But it's in lovely North Yorkshire, where you can visit a lot of other cool historic houses. So you can be like the Peach family and go and try and hit as many as you possibly can while you're there. There's no shortage of places to visit. And it's a wonderful place. And not only that, you can stop and have tea and cake and all that good stuff, probably at most of them. And then look forward to maybe having you back on next year when you can tell us a little bit more about where you're headed next. But thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fantastic to talk to you guys and tell you about the work we've been doing.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.